This machine will have eyes, ears, and a voice.
This is PVP Television News.
Well, it's not the breakup of Montgomeryshire, it's the straightforward demolition of Montgomeryshire. I know my view is pretty clear. I think it's devastating for me. I can understand how all the people at this meeting feel. Where we can, I mean, it influences what I think, and I want to convey that same feeling to my colleagues at Westminster. And I was genuinely surprised by how little people know. How almost nobody understands how we got to where we are and actually where we are and what you can do about it. So I just thought I'd have a meeting. I'm intending to talk for about 10 minutes, something like that, just to run through the history of where we are, and then you'll be able to have some idea about what we can do about it. I just wrote to community councillors and I just said other people can come if they want, anybody who's interested in the issue. So that's why we were doing it. And now the start of this, and it really is completely the start of it, was the expenses scandal in 2009. Was it 2008, 2009? When the public became pretty disillusioned with MPs generally. Now at that stage, all the political parties were tripping over themselves for their 2010 manifesto about how they could be most harsh with MPs. The rougher you could be on MPs, the more you stood a chance in the election. Now the Conservative position, this new boy they've got, David Cameron, his campaign, his manifesto, the Tory manifesto, was that they were going to cut the number of MPs by 10%, from 650 to 585. The Liberal Democrats were going to cut them to 500, a much bigger cut. And you know, as happened, nobody won the election, and there was a coalition formed, and then there was a programme for government. Those two parties then negotiated their government. And there were two things that are relevant to us in this. One was that they were going to hold a referendum on a new voting system. That's the alternative vote system. And these two were completely linked. And the act was called, what was it called? The Parliamentary Voting System and Constituencies Act. Hi, Joy. Now, one was going to be the AV referendum, and that was held, I think, in 2011. Was it? No, it was before that, I think. No, it was 2011. And the other was to cut the number of MP constituencies to 600. It was an 8% cut. So it wasn't the Lib Dem cut and it wasn't the Tory cut, it was less than that. It was to cut it by 8%. And that went through Parliament, and it was an act that had other parts of it as well, but it was approved in November 2011. And the only bit left was to actually identify the exact line of the boundaries. I mean, there were some key things in that. I remember the discussions I was having at the time, and I must say it was very difficult to generate much interest in that act at the time. It was, you know, people weren't connected with it. Now, I didn't want to cut the number of MPs because I knew what impact it would have on the rural parts of Britain. I just thought it would be hugely damaging to the rural parts of Britain. I didn't want to do that, and the other thing I didn't want to do was to have the numbers in each seat being almost the same. I thought there should be an element of tolerance, maybe 10%, you know, to allow the boundary commissioners to make some allowance for history and culture and geography and things like that. But the act went through, taken through by Nick Clegg actually, and it was passed, and it was a 5% tolerance. Well, I mean, I knew straight away that Montgomeryshire didn't stand a chance. I knew that what I was used to here was going to be in real trouble. And so you were immediately looking for ways to, well, I was looking for ways to try to scupper it, which I shouldn't be because there was an act of Parliament passed. And in my own party's interests, I could see it works in favour of the Conservative Party. Only because the current system works very much against the Conservative Party. I mean, you know, we need to win about 38% of the vote to form a government. Labour needs to win about 33, 34% of the vote, because of the way people have moved over the last 30 years. Anyway, that was passed, and it was passed absolutely. The whole thing was all over and done with. in 2011. But then the House of Lords, in a pretty disgraceful way, actually, introduced a 5-year delay. They put an amendment to a completely different bill. It wasn't to do with this at all, but they can, and the people in the Lords have sort of said you can't do this. If it was in the House of Commons, we couldn't have done it. Because somebody says you can't do it constitutionally, you can't do it. But the Lords can do whatever they want. And they introduced a 5-year delay. And that delay comes to an end in October 2018. And it's the lead up to that we're starting now, because all the act has gone through. But so the Boundary Commission have produced their boundary. And I should also say that in Wales it's a bit more extreme, because the cut in Wales is much bigger than anywhere else, because we've always been overrepresented. I mean, it's not an unusual thing in countries that are really sort of federal to have the smaller countries with a higher proportion, pro rata to the population than other parts. But we've got a National Assembly, Welsh Assembly now, and you just can't justify it. So we should, at the moment, to be the same as England, we should have 34 MPs, but we've got 40. Of course, the cut brings it down to 29, which is much bigger than anywhere else. And of course, in Wales, you've also got the sea around you on 3 sides and an English border on the other side, so there's no flexibility for the boundary commissioners. So when people have been critical of boundary commissioners now, I just say, well, you can't be. They've got no choice. They've got an act when every seat has got to be within between 72 and 78,000 electorate, roughly. It's got to be, and it's got to be within the borders of England and the sea and things like that. And they pretty well done the only way they could do it. That's the difficulty. So when you are challenging it, it becomes a real problem. Now, when I saw the bill, I could see some changes at the margins. I call them changes at the margin, which are important to those affected, but it is at the margin. And one of them involved roughly where I live, which is Fordon and Berry. Now, Fordon and Berry seem to me to be more orientated towards the north than they do to the south. They're part of the Welshmoor catchment, if you like, rather than the Newtown catchment. So I thought that should be moved over. And I just thought having Llanidloes and Blaenhafren in Ceredigion and North Pembrokeshire, I thought was just lunatic. It was completely daft. And so I thought that should come back in to the south, Brecon and Radnor and South Powys. I thought it came back and it fitted in there reasonably well. And that's what the Conservative Party proposal is. I mean, the party accepted what I wanted. And I don't think the other parties are opposing it. So I would think there's a pretty good chance of those changes on the border going through. But the reality is, unless something happens, there's the Act would go through with just those minor changes. There might be other small changes. And this is we've got the first draft. There'll be 2 more drafts. The final draft will be voted on in October 2018, in time for the next election. That's the that's the current position. So how will we change that? I mean, because the trouble is, you can't just say, well, they don't start from Montgomeryshire. I mean, the example I tend to give is, if you start from Anglesey, I mean, Anglesey's got about 40, 50,000. You've got to take 20,000 from over the border, over the Menai Strait to make that into a constituency. Well, then you've got to get another constituency next to it with 75,000, which comes further south. And what happens, inevitably happens, which I knew it would, is that the whole of the middle of Wales then gets just chopped up into pieces to make the others reach the numbers. And that's what's happened. And that's where we are. Now what I can do about it, because you can, and I think the local association here are considering challenging it, which effectively is a new plan. And best if anybody wants to do that, then I'm very happy with them doing it. But I do think, and I think I have said, I do think that's tantamount actually to wanting the Act scuppered. I just think the changes are so radical that in effect you're asking for the Act to be not suspended, but just not to go forward as an Act that was passed. And that would be pretty unusual for a government with a pretty big majority to pass an Act and then later on just to leave it lie on the books, if you like, unenacted. You know, that would be pretty strange. But that's what I think that's tantamount to, because you'd be when you come with those boundaries, you'd be proposing things that just wouldn't be acceptable. But the boundary commissioners, who are they're a good bunch, one of them lives locally. You know, they'll do what they can, but there's very, very little they can do. So we're a bit stuck. So we're back in the position that we were in, I suppose, 2011, 12, when you've got those of us who don't like this. And I've got a choice. You can stand up and down and make a massive noise about it, but you won't get anywhere. If you only pushed it on another 6 months, the timetable is such that you might just scupper it. Because if you pushed it on into 2019, it's an election in May 2020. Well, it wouldn't be possible. Because there'd be new constituencies, there'd be new associations to set up for all the parties now. There'd be new candidates to choose for an election in 12 months' time. Well, I just don't think you'd be able to do that. And I suspect they'd suspend it until after. So there'd be another 5 years gone. But we'll have to just wait and see what happens. But you can see how difficult it is. Anyway, I've talked for longer than I usually. For me, that's a pretty long speech, actually. But it's left you with any queries and questions. I mean, you know, it's a bit for somebody who really cares about the old county, and I do. It's a pretty depressing prospect, and I suppose I can keep a reasonably sane tone in my voice because I've known about it for about 5 years, I guess. It isn't a shock to me anymore because I've lived with it for a while, knowing it was coming. Anyway, has anybody got any queries or questions or what they might think?
Glyn, a lot of concern here tonight at this meeting about the breakup of Montgomeryshire. What's your general view on this on the whole?
Well, it's not the breakup of Montgomeryshire, it's the straightforward demolition of Montgomeryshire. I know my view is pretty clear. I think it's devastating for me. I can understand how all the people at this meeting feel. Where we can, I mean, it influences what I think, and I want to convey that same feeling to my colleagues at Westminster, and that's what I'll do.
Well, I understand that this is the first draft. There's 2 more drafts. Yeah. What do you think the final draft will contain?
It's early days, but I do know that the boundary commissioners themselves will have very little flexibility. The Act that was passed in 2011 made it very difficult for them to take anything into account other than straightforward numbers. And I think that's a pity, and I'm rather hoping perhaps we can introduce some amendments to that. But there's a big battle over this to come, and I'm going to do my best if I can to try to introduce some common sense into the parliamentary democratic system in Mid Wales.